Shelly Ann Bascu was just 16 years old when she disappeared. It was a cool summer's night in Hinton, Canada, when she went to babysit at her boyfriend's brother's house just a few miles from home. Around 8 p.m., she went to go home, but she didn't make it, and after that night, no one ever saw Shelly again. Lauren Dawn Leslie was just 15 when she hitched a ride into Prince George to hang out with friends. Instead, she was picked up by a serial killer and taken north of Highway 27, where she met her grisly end. Shelly and Lauren aren't alone, far from it. They're just two of more than 80 girls and women who've died or gone missing along the most infamous highway in Canada. Since the 60s, these disappearances have earned the highway a chilling reputation and a name that matches its horror: the Highway of Tears. The Highway of Tears is a section of the Trans-Canada Highway stretching more than 450 miles from Prince Rupert to Prince George in the Canadian province of British Columbia. Properly a part of British Columbia's Highway 16, the road underwent construction throughout the 50s and 60s before being reopened in 1969. After its reopening, it wouldn't be long until the first confirmed victim disappeared along the highway, but more on that soon. Before we get into the many examples of people who've gone missing and why, I want to describe the area so that you get a good understanding of why it's so dangerous. The first reason the Highway of Tears is so dangerous is because it's practically uninhabited. In the Trans-Canada Highway system, roads that the most people travel on are marked Highway 1, and Highway 16 refers to a secondary, less trafficked route. You can see this difference just by looking at them. Highway 1 has 4 lanes in most places, and Highway 16 only has 2. Besides being less traffic, Highway 16 mostly goes through small communities in British Columbia, which itself is incredibly unpopulated. For example, despite being 50% bigger than Texas, British Columbia has less people living there than Dallas-Fort Worth. The Highway of Tears' 2 biggest communities, Prince George and Terrace, have a combined metro population of just over 100,000, and that's nowadays. Back then, it might have been half that. Other communities are lucky to have 1,000 people, and they can be far and few in between. For the most part, the Highway of Tears is surrounded by lakes and wilderness for miles and miles and miles on every side. We're talking millions of acres of land to disappear in. You can drive for a long time on the highway and not see a single soul. In a place like that, all a murderer has to do is throw your body in the forest and you'll never be seen again. Besides being desolate, the Highway of Tears was a dead zone for most of its history. It didn't even start to get cell service until 2021, and public transport along the highway was also non-existent until very recently. That means for most of its history, if you didn't have a car, you either had to walk along the road or hitchhike, and a lot of people ended up choosing the latter. For reasons I'll explain later, most victims probably didn't have a license, let alone a car, so hitchhiking was a popular option. Additionally, since so few people came through the road, if you were hitching a ride, you'd have to take the first car you saw, otherwise you could be waiting a long time for another one to come through. There are a number of reasons why people hitchhike on the Highway of Tears, including going to work, going to parties, visiting family, and more. As one British Columbia resident puts it, some are traveling, some are going tree planting, and some are just coming into Prince George to do some shopping. One of the earliest known victims of the highway, an 18-year-old girl named Micheline Paré, was herself a hitchhiker. Originally from Quebec, the young girl was last seen in Hudson, British Columbia in July 1970. At the time, 2 women had picked her up and taken her to Tompkins Ranch, a ranch just off of Highway 20. Not too long after, on August 8th, Micheline's body was discovered a few miles away near Hudson's Hope. As a group of berry pickers were walking along the highway, they came across Micheline's body, which was badly beaten and decomposed. After the cops investigated it, they came to believe that the girl had been assaulted as well, though her body was too decomposed to know for certain. Police circulated information about Micheline and asked for tips to help solve the crime, but in the end, nothing became of it. To this day, her murder remains unsolved. Given the plethora of murders and missing persons cases centered around the highway, you have to wonder what exactly is going on. Are these freak accidents? Are animals eating people? Is there a serial killer going around and abducting women, or even multiple serial killers? Over the years, police have asked these exact same questions. Investigations into the murders initially took place in the 80s as police had noticed a rash of killings not only on British Columbia highways, but also in Alberta. Called the Highway Murders, the investigation saw more than 40 officers work the case, and their efforts revealed some interesting leads. Suspicious vehicles were a common theme, as were certain persons of interest. Police floated a couple of potential suspect names, including Clifford Robert Olson, a Canadian serial killer who confessed to murdering 11 victims, and Ted Bundy, whom I actually made a video on. You can check it out if you want to learn all about him. The Bundy connection might seem like a cop-out, especially since it came just days after Bundy was executed, but Bundy's supposed victim did show his trademark signs of assault, including bite marks like those which were used to convict him in Florida. In the end, the highway murders investigation didn't lead to any convictions, and it would end up being replaced by a new investigation in 2005. In 2005, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched Project E-Pana, an investigation into the Highway of Tears, which is still going on to this day. Police had noticed similarities in the murders of Alicia Germain, Roxanne Tiara, and Ramona Wilson, ages 15, 15, and 16. All three teens' bodies were found extremely close to Highway 16, which made police wonder if they were connected. They began examining other murder cases near the highway and soon came up with 3 criteria to be considered as part of the investigation. Victims had to be female, discovered or last seen near Highway 16, and involved in a high-risk activity such as hitchhiking or prostitution. Under these guidelines, the police came up with a list of 9 initial victims whose names and faces you can see on the screen now. Of these initial 9, 8 were Indigenous Canadians. Project E-Pana itself is named after an Inuit goddess, Pana, who in the Inuit religion safeguards souls until they can be reborn. In 2007, E-Pana's scope was expanded to include a larger portion of Highway 16 going into Alberta, as well as parts of Highways 97 and 5. With this expanded scope came 9 more confirmed victims of the Highway of Tears, some of whom I've already mentioned. Once again, their names and faces are on the screen. This brings the confirmed victim count up to 18, but there were likely far more missing and dead girls by that time. Modern estimates put the victim count at over 40 and possibly over 80, although those estimates might include more nearby highways than E-Pana does. At one point, more than 60 officers were involved in the E-Pana investigation, taking tips from locals, reaching out to impacted families, and looking into all the confirmed victims to see if they could crack the case. Despite the effort, only 2 of the initial 18 cases have been solved, and in the meantime, girls have continued to die and go missing near the highway. Amidst the continued carnage, frustrated locals began to criticize the police, alleging a lack of care on their part as well as misaction and prejudice, and they may be right. But before we get into that, I want to look at some of the highway's victims more closely, now that I've given some background on the case. Gloria Moody is the first known victim of the Highway of Tears. She was an Indigenous woman from the Bella Coola Reserve in British Columbia. A mother of 2, Gloria was 27 years old when she went on a family trip to Williams Lake, a scenic area about 300 miles from her home. At the time, a 12-hour drive. Her parents urged her to go on the trip to spend some time away from her unfaithful and abusive common-law husband. Her brother Dave and their parents were traveling with her while her kids stayed at their aunt's house. On October 23, 1969, the family left the reserve and spent the night at Anaheim Lake before continuing to Williams Lake the next day. They arrived on the afternoon of the 24th and checked into the Ranch Hotel, a hotel and bar at their destination. The next day, Gloria and Dave decided to do some bar hopping, visiting a few local spots including the Lakeview and the Maple Leaf before returning to the Ranch Hotel. They were seen at the Ranch Hotel's bar around 10 p.m., after which time Dave left to go back to their room. While he was walking, Dave turned around to say something to Gloria, but she wasn't there. He thought she was right behind him the whole time, but when he turned around, she was nowhere to be found. No one at the bar recalled seeing her leave either. The next morning, 2 people, a mechanic and his friend, drove out to a small lake or pond just a few miles from Williams Lake. On the way back, they noticed Gloria's body on a small cattle trail and immediately called the police. The scene was horrific. When police found her, Gloria's body was naked and beaten, her clothes tossed nearby, and she showed signs of a brutal assault. The coroner determined that she had bled to death, which may have taken as much as half an hour after the assault. Police started an investigation, but no one in town had seen Gloria leave the bar, so there weren't any leads to go on. To make things worse, the town was especially busy that weekend, as it was a paid weekend off for many workers, and a local 4-H sale helped fill hotels to capacity. In short, there were too many potential perpetrators and next to no way to narrow them down. Gloria's family was shaken by the murder. Her father blamed himself for her death. Gloria's daughter Vanessa said that he locked himself in my mom's room and he just lay there. He didn't eat or sleep, and when he came out, everybody in the whole town talked about how his hair went pure white. After Gloria's death, her parents adopted and raised her 2 children. Though police made an investigation into the murder, it took nearly 3 decades for Gloria's family to find out anything about it. When they did, Vanessa says, police gave them 3 suspect names who might have killed the young mother, including a possible bartender in Williams Lake named Al Blome. Blome was well liked by the local police detachment, which may have helped him slip under the radar. Allegedly, Al would get women drunk and then assault them. A woman claiming to be his wife even reported him to the police after he died, saying she feared him while he was alive and that he committed demented acts of sexual abuse on her as well. Unfortunately, neither Al nor anyone else was ever arrested for the crime, and all 3 suspects passed away before the family was notified of their potential involvement, meaning no one knows whether they really committed the crimes. Vanessa has said that some Williams Lake residents told her that townspeople know who did it, but that they just won't say, perhaps out of fear or to protect the killer. Another Williams Lake resident on Reddit told me that anti-Indigenous sentiment is widespread in the community, even among the police, and that this case doesn't surprise them at all. After Gloria, there were at least 11 disappearances and deaths along the Highway of Tears throughout the 70s, including Micheline Paré, whom I mentioned before, and Monica Jack. Monica Jack, who disappeared along the Highway of Tears in 1978, is the highway's youngest victim. After riding bikes with her friend all day in Merritt, a small town in British Columbia, Monica was on her way home alone. Convicted rapist Gary Taylor Handlin, who was out on parole, then abducted her while she was cycling. Though her bike was found at the nearby Nicola Lake, her body was nowhere to be seen. It wouldn't be found until 17 years later when forestry workers discovered her remains on Swackham Mountain, not far from the reservation she lived on. Police quickly suspected that Handlin was behind the girl's disappearance, even interviewing him just 1 month after she disappeared. However, they couldn't tie him to the crime, so for years he went free. He wouldn't be free forever though. In 2014, police began a Mr. Big investigation on Handlin, posing as criminals in order to lure him into their criminal organization. Police in Canada use these types of investigations to elicit confessions from suspects in cold cases, and it worked. After committing other crimes for the organization, Handlin was eager to move up in the ranks. An officer pretending to be the organization's boss met Handlin and told him that he wanted to give him a promotion, but that there was one problem. His DNA was found on a dead girl's body, so he was under police investigation. The boss apparently knew this because of an informant he had in the police station. If Handlin told them what happened, he said, he could make the situation go away so Handlin wouldn't have to go back to jail. At this point, Handlin admitted to having sex with Monica and strangling her before burning her clothes and throwing her body behind a log. When asked if he remembered any details about the young girl, Handlin said, "All I know is she was Indian." Unbeknownst to him, the entire conversation was taped. That confession was key evidence in his trial, and in 2019, Handlin was found guilty of Monica's murder and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 15 years. He unsuccessfully appealed the conviction shortly after. At the time of sentencing, Handlin was 71 years old, so he was probably 29 or 30 when he committed the crime. Monica herself was just a week away from turning 13 years old. In 3 of the 70s cases, police list Bobby Jack Fowler as a suspect. Fowler was a and likely serial killer from Texas. Born in 1939, Fowler had an extensive criminal history, although he managed to escape charges for most of his crimes. In 1969, for example, he was charged for murdering a man and woman in Texas, but ended up only being convicted of discharging a firearm in city limits. He was a construction worker, which allowed him to get jobs wherever he traveled, and in 1974, he worked for the Prince George Construction Company in British Columbia, right along Highway 16. His DNA was found on Colleen McMillan's body, which led to the RCMP announcing him as her killer in 2012, although he was already dead by that time, having passed in 2006 while serving a 16-year sentence for rape and kidnapping in Oregon. Though he escaped charges for most of his crimes, Fowler is suspected to be guilty of possibly more than 100 and murders in the United States and Canada. As you can probably tell, most of the 70s cases are officially unsolved. The 80s cases fare a bit better. Although all 3 Ipana cases from this decade remain unsolved, 4 other cases involving the Highway of Tears have better conclusions. After Marie Blanchard left a nightclub in Prince George at 2 a.m. on November 22, 1989, she entered into a gray Toyota pickup truck and was never seen again. Her body was found a few weeks later by a couple of skiers on Foothill Boulevard, a path not far outside the city. Her killer, Brian Peter Arp, would be arrested the following July, though evidence was lacking to convict him. Although he submitted DNA samples to the police, the technology wasn't good enough to establish a definitive connection. A few years later, Arp was arrested for another murder, again in Prince George. At the same time, police re-arrested him for the murder of Marie Blanchard, and he was convicted of both murders in 1995 since DNA technology had improved enough to make his guilt evident. From late 1901 to mid-1982, serial killer Edward Dennis Isaac terrorized the Prince George community, killing at least 3 women and girls: 36-year-old Jean-Marie Kovacs, 13-year-old Roswitha Fuchsbiegler, and 15-year-old Nina Marie Joseph. I apologize if I mispronounce any of those names. Kovacs was dangerously drunk on the night of her death. She got kicked out of a bar around midnight on the 10th of October, then went home to continue drinking. After that, she took a taxi to the intersection of Old Caribou Highway and Highway 16 East, not far outside of town. Now past 1:30 a.m., she waited on the road, planning to hitchhike into Jasper or Edmonton. This is presumably when Isaac picked her up, no doubt taking advantage of her drunken state and luring her into his car. He ended up shooting her in the head 4 times and carving her body up before dumping her body in a ditch near Purden Lake, about 25 miles outside of the city. Her body was discovered the next day by a man who went out to the lake to collect firewood. A month later, on November 14th, Roswitha left a house party early in the morning to meet up with a man with whom she had made plans, hitchhiking to his apartment since he didn't show up to the agreed upon gas station to pick her up. Leaving his apartment, she again hitched a ride with the stranger, but this time it was Isaac who picked her up. He strangled her, mutilated her body, and stabbed her in the heart, in his words, just to see what it felt like. Her body was found a week later in the woods behind Highway 97, little more than a dozen miles from the party. Nina Marie Joseph, who died on August 16th, was Isaac's last victim. Just 15 years old, Joseph was a prostitute, and Isaac claims to have killed her during a sexual encounter. Once again, he strangled the young girl and mutilated her body. This time, he got his girlfriend to help him move the body, posing it grotesquely inside Freeman Park, inside the city. He threatened his girlfriend not to tell the police, and at first, she didn't. Once she moved away from Prince George, however, she no longer felt afraid of him, so she told the cops all about Nina's murder, and Isaac was promptly arrested. After his arrest, Isaac pleaded guilty to all 3 murders, each in its own case. Witnesses reported that his dead brother Jim helped him to lure, shoot, and mutilate Kovacs, but Jim himself was dead by the time Isaac was on trial, himself a victim of murder. For his crimes, Isaac received 3 life sentences with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The 90s are when the Cornerstone Ipana cases took place. Ramona Wilson, Roxanne Tiara, and Alicia Germain were all murdered in 1994, and all 3 murders remain unsolved. Ramona was hitchhiking from Smithers to Hazleton, a town a little over 40 miles from her home, where she planned to meet up with her friend Crystal Grinke at a dance. However, she never made it. When they realized she was missing, Ramona's family called the cops, who told them to give it some time and see if she showed up. She didn't. Her body would be found almost a year later when some young boys riding near the forest behind Smithers Airport got their 4-wheelers stuck in the mud. They went into the woods to get something to pry it out, and that's when they saw Ramona's body. Nearby laid her clothes, some rope, and some nylon cables. Roxanne was a rather sad case, even among all these sad cases. Born in Manitoba and adopted at a young age, Roxanne grew up in Quesnel, where she began to miss school and associate with a quote-unquote bad bunch. At 12 years old, she ended up being arrested for some petty offense, and after her incarceration, her brother says her behavior took a turn for the worse. She ran away to Williams Lake, just an hour or so south of home, and began doing drugs, prostituting herself to survive. Even though she ran away, she would still stop by her home in Quesnel sometimes, and on one visit, she told her mother that she'd like to get off drugs and was planning to get into rehab. She planned to go to Williams Lake to get her belongings and be back the next day. Unfortunately for Roxanne, that never happened. After leaving home for the last time, she stayed in Williams Lake for a few weeks, and in July of 1994, she would leave with a client and never be seen again. Her body was found outside Burns Lake on August 17th, hundreds of miles from where she was last seen. The last Cornerstone victim, Alicia Germain, was actually a friend of Roxanne's. She didn't have the best life growing up, so at 12, she ran away from her Prince George home and ended up addicted to drugs and prostituting herself to survive, much like Roxanne. Shortly before she died, now 15, Alicia had plans to quit drugs and get back in school to live a better life. Unfortunately, she didn't get the chance, as she was murdered after leaving a Christmas party for homeless children thrown by the Prince George Native Friendship Center. That night, on December 9th, 1994, Alicia left the dance with plans to return, having asked the youth worker to save her one of the presents donated by locals. Her body, full of stab wounds, was found that same night at 11 o'clock by some teenagers who were walking near a local elementary school. Though police had a suspect in mind, no one was ever arrested for her murder. Another case from the 90s that really stands out to me is the murder of Delphine Nicole. Delphine was a 15-year-old from Smithers who disappeared in July of 1990 while on her way home from hanging out with friends, including one friend named Crystal Grinke, who I think might be the same Crystal Grinke that knew Ramona. Delphine and company were last seen at Mohawk Gas Station, a gas station on the intersection of Highway 16 and Main Street, and one employee mentioned seeing Delphine get into a red sports car. After calling her uncle to tell him that she was on her way home, Delphine hitched a ride and was never seen again. But the story gets crazier. Her cousin Cecilia Nicole disappeared from Vancouver the year before, and before that, her other cousin Roberta Nicole was killed after leaving a camping trip in Cultus Lake, a small getaway destination right outside her hometown of Surrey. Surrey and Cultus Lake are both very close to Vancouver, which is itself hours south of Smithers. To make things even crazier, a witness last saw Roberta on the side of the road talking to a man in a red sports car. Now, there are plenty of red sports cars in the world, and Surrey is hours away from Smithers, so I'm not saying it's all connected, but it very well could be. Roberta's sister said that she was killed by a serial killer who later killed himself, which, given the amount of serial killers we've seen so far, doesn't surprise me. I myself wonder whether the same killer was stalking the family. None of these murders have ever been officially solved, unfortunately, so I can't say either way. The wildest murder along the Highway of Tears is definitely the murder of Donna May Charlie. She and her boyfriend Jerry Smoslett checked into a motel in Prince George at the start of September in 1990. A few days later, Smoslett asked the motel staff not to disturb him, and the next day he checked out alone. When the motel staff entered their room, it was covered in blood. The floor, the walls, the chair and the bed, there was even a head-sized hole in the bathroom floor filled with hair and blood. Donna was declared a missing person, and the following April her body was found, but her head was missing. Smoslett was arrested and denied being involved in her death. According to him, the two had been doing drugs together and ended up drinking behind the motel afterwards. He then went to a nearby convenience store, and when he came back, she was on her side, blue and foaming from the mouth. She wasn't breathing, and scared that he would be arrested, Jerry buried her body to avoid a trial. The biggest problem with this story, obviously, was the fact that her head was missing, and it wouldn't be found until long after his trial and prison sentence. The truth is that Smoslett killed Donna and later called his nephew to help bury her body in the park across the street, Ingledew Park. While they were dragging the body, her head fell off, so they put it in a bucket and buried it in Connaught Park, a park right behind Prince George City Hall. Her skull wouldn't be found until late in 2022 when a park goer noticed it sticking out from the ground. In 1992, Smoslett was found guilty of second-degree murder. Witnesses said that he had admitted to them that he killed Donna, but Smoslett himself said otherwise. His conviction was later overturned, and in 1995 he was instead convicted of manslaughter, serving an additional year in prison after the 3 he had already served. At the time of her death, Donna was 22 and Smoslett was around 29. Smoslett is a serial abuser. He beat Donna more than once, and motel staff recalled her face being bloody on the last day she was seen alive. A woman who testified at his trial says that while they were in a relationship, the two lived in a motel and he wouldn't let her leave the motel without him. She only managed to escape in a taxi one day while the bathroom was being fixed. He beat his girlfriend before Donna, a 15-year-old girl, and told her that all pretty girls deserve to die, and he beat another woman after he was released from prison, earning him more time in jail in 2007 for being a dangerous offender. While I was doing research for this video, I actually came across his Facebook page without even trying. I don't want anyone to harass him, obviously, but it is a bit insane to me to see someone posting so casually knowing that they killed a woman. Of course, killings along the highway didn't stop in the 90s. They've kept on to today, and here's a pretty recent example. One of the youngest serial killers in Canadian history, Cody Legabokov, is connected to the Highway of Tears. A Prince George native, Cody committed at least 3 murders in his hometown and 1 outside it. His final victim, Lauren Dawn Leslie, was a young, legally blind girl who lived in the nearby town of Vanderhoof and who would often hitch rides into Prince George to hang out with friends. Cody likely met Lauren on Exopia, a now defunct Canadian social media site that at one point had over 1 million users. One country boy, as he was called on the site, picked Lauren up in 2010 and drove her out to a remote logging site near Highway 27, just a few minutes north of her hometown, where he would kill her and toss her body in the woods. As he came back onto the highway, a police officer noticed blood on his car and, thinking that Cody was poaching, pulled him over. He kept the young man in place while a game warden went back the way Cody came, following his tire marks to find his prey. When he made it to the kill site, he was shocked to find Lauren's freshly murdered body. Cody was arrested, and in 2014 he was convicted of her murder as well as the murders of 3 women in Prince George. For his crimes, he received a life sentence with no possibility of parole. At the time of his first murder, Cody was just 19 years old. These cases are all just a splash in the bucket. In all, there may be 80 or more disappearances and deaths connected to the Highway of Tears. Many are committed by serial killers, though they aren't the only culprits. Aside from serial killers and regular killers like Smoslett, the highway has seen racists, such as the pair of brothers who intentionally swerved to hit native pedestrians, arsonists who killed an entire family along the highway, and more. The amount of serial killers and other unhinged people in British Columbia honestly shocked me. Like I said before, only 5 million people live in the entire province and less than 100,000 live in Prince George, but the city has potentially had multiple active serial killers for decades. I did a video a while ago on another would-be serial killer in British Columbia, an amateur film director from Edmonton named Mark Twitchell, who was way in over his head and ended up writing a screenplay based off of a murder he actually did. He thought he could fool detectives but was caught pretty easily, and the way he was caught is hilarious. If you like this video, you should definitely check that one out. Unfortunately, most of the deaths and disappearances around the Highway of Tears remain unsolved, and they may remain that way forever. Although the Ipana investigation had more than 60 to 70 officers working on it at its peak, that number has dwindled to around 12 nowadays, and funding for the investigation has shrunk dramatically. And, as I said before, the Ipana case only covers some of the disappearances. Aside from that, investigations into the Highway of Tears have been plagued with problems from the beginning. One officer who was transferred to the Williams Lake Detachment in the 80s recalled the sad state of affairs when he arrived. Case files were haphazardly kept, and notes didn't even have basic information needed to follow up on them. One official brought charges against officers working on the Ipana case for deleting essential emails relating to the investigation. And although it isn't directly about the Highway of Tears, a judge in Prince George was himself found guilty of being with and beating underage prostitutes, so the problem is obviously not just with the killers. Given the number of native victims along the highway, racism is an obvious concern, especially given Canada's treatment of natives in the last century. Stories such as Saskatchewan's Starlight tours, wherein officers arrested drunk natives and drove them to the cold desert and left them to walk back into town, don't exactly inspire confidence in the police system. Some people even theorize that police are involved in sex trafficking some of the highway's victims, which, given the aforementioned judge, is believable. Systemic issues plague the indigenous community's ability to obtain driver's license, including poor monetary situations, uneasy access to documents needed to obtain licenses, less computer, internet, and phone access, and more. It's estimated that upwards to 75% of those who live on reservations in Canada don't have a license, which is part of why hitchhiking is so common along Highway 16 and why indigenous people especially are so at risk. Of course, non-native victims are also at risk when hitchhiking, such as Laura Leslie, whom I mentioned earlier. For all the bad press the highway deservedly gets, some good developments have come around. As a result of public pressure, Highway 16 in British Columbia now has cell service all over, and buses have even started running so that people won't have to hitchhike. Some people even run driving schools and programs aimed to help the indigenous communities. As the public refuses to give up on the investigation, good results continue to follow. Even so, we may never know the true extent of the highway's horrors. How many have gone missing or died, and how many killers are out there? If you're ever in British Columbia, make sure you stay safe. Don't hitchhike, especially on Highway 16, because you never know who could be out there waiting patiently for the next victim. I hope you enjoyed the video, so I would love if you left a like, commented your thoughts below, and subscribed. What do you think about the highway? Are there more killers on the loose than we know, or is the worst of it behind us? Be sure to check out the rest of the videos on my channel. Besides true crime, I do all sorts of scary and mysterious content, and you can contact me or comment below if you have a topic you want to see done. If you would like to support me and help me upload videos faster, please subscribe to my Patreon in the description. It comes with plenty of awesome perks, including having your name displayed in my videos and extra in-depth information about highlighted cases. There's so much more I could say about the Highway of Tears, so if you want more videos on these cases, let me know. There are sources in the description too, so you can read all about it if you want. Be sure to turn on notifications because I have plenty of awesome content coming soon. Until next time, I'm Mr. Mysteries, and thanks for watching.